It's no secret that America loves meritocracy. It's driven into our core from a young age. The American dream. The idea that anyone can come here and make something of themselves with enough hard work, grit, and determination. I'm not gonna lie, I quite like the sound of that, and so do a lot of others. But I also recognize that America, and life in general really, is unfair in a lot of ways. To believe that you can always have a pure meritocracy is a pretty silly idea. But if meritocracy is bad, what are our alternatives? After all, it is the system which inherently exists in nature. You either farm the best or you starve, you either run the fastest or you get eaten, you either fight the hardest or you get killed. During my time at college, some of my professors, in all their great and infinite wisdom, didn't just stop at the idea of meritocracy being hard to implement in our society. They went so far as to claim that because life isn't fair, meritocracy can never truly be implemented, and therefore should not be pursued as the desired system for our society. Clearly, this interpretation was influenced by their desire to try and foster a more equitable society. Impoverished people and minorities can, and do, struggle to access the same opportunities as more privileged people. But in principle, meritocracy is seemingly the only system which would permit the disadvantaged to distinguish themselves as just as competent as the elite. But in order to fully understand why meritocracy is so important, we need to travel to the most backwards country to have ever existed. The Soviet Union. More specifically, Ukraine during the 1930s. After the events of the Russian Revolution, Lenin attempted to consolidate what was left of the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union. This included the Democratic Ukrainian People's Republic, which would later be reintegrated as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This integration, and Lenin's requisition of all surplus agricultural products from the rural population, led to a complete economic collapse within Ukraine. In order to fix this collapse and foster new growth, Lenin implemented the New Economic Policy, or NEP, which allowed marginal autonomy and competition within the larger Soviet economy. The state still controlled large enterprises, but this new mixed economy helped to revitalize what was left after the devastation of the Russian Revolution. The NEP also abolished the state's forced grain acquisition from farmers, substituting instead a tax which could be paid in the form of raw agricultural goods. This provided a massive boon to many of the poor Ukrainian subsistence farmers. Some of these farmers became rather successful from this new system, and came to be known as kulaks. They were able to exchange their raw goods for monetary compensation, providing an incentive to produce more and expand. Overall, the NEP fostered a massive boom in agricultural production, surpassing even pre-revolution levels. The success of the kulaks, who were outpacing the rest of the industrial economy, sent waves through the Soviet economic system. Since the heavy industry within Russia was still owned by the inept state, it was consequently lagging far behind the agricultural industry. The supply of agricultural goods skyrocketed, and farmers had more money to spend, resulting in the demand for industrial goods increasing, causing what will be known as the scissors crisis. Because, I guess the graph looks like a pair of scissors. As the prices of agricultural goods went down, the price of industrial goods went up, causing a cross in the graph. This resulted in what the Soviet state saw as an exploitation of the urban working class, and created a worrying problem. There is now a group of people within the Soviet system who are far more successful than the rest, and who have a strong sense of individualism and nationalism. When Stalin came to power in 1928, he needed substantial financial capital in order to invest into his 5-year plans, to industrialize the rest of the Soviet economy. But where was he to get this money? Coincidentally, the success of the kulaks also presented the greatest threat to Stalin's power at the time. Having a group of semi-successful and intellectual landowners whose prosperity was determined by non-Soviet means was seen as a threat to Stalin, as the Ukrainians could rise up in a counter-revolution. In classic Soviet fashion, the only way to get rid of the problem was through propaganda and liquidation. Stalin, along with other Soviet economists, created the narrative that independent farmers were too small and disorganized to provide the necessary grain to support his 5-year plans, and that the kulaks were bourgeois grain hoarders who were exhibiting non-Soviet behavior. So he enacted a series of collectivization reforms to forcibly remove and replace the successful kulaks onto collectivized farms. By taking their money and land, Stalin was essentially eliminating the kulaks as a social class. Resistance to these reforms was immense, and it is estimated that there were about 4,000 rebellions and protests in response to these new policies. The Soviet Secret Police, or NKVD, was used to liquidate anyone offering any resistance. Upwards of 400,000 kulaks died in gulags or labor camps, with an almost equal number also being executed over the course of the Great Purge. But this wasn't enough for Stalin. In 1932, obscene quotas for grain procurement were implemented, resulting in a massive artificial famine within Ukraine, or what would later be known as the Holodomor. As starvation spread, many peasants sought food within cities or industrialized areas. In response, Stalin sealed the borders of Ukraine and implemented a system of internal passports which restricted the movement of only Ukrainian farmers. In August of 1932, the decree of 5 stalks of grain stated that anyone, even a child, caught taking any produce from a collective field could be shot or imprisoned for stealing socialist property. The situation became incredibly dire as people turned to eating whatever was available to them: grass, acorns, even cats and dogs. Some resorted to cannibalism to stave off starvation. Villages who did not meet the colossal grain quotas were put on a blacklist. These villages would then be surrounded by the NKVD and blockaded from any food or supplies from getting in, while also preventing anyone from leaving, essentially dooming whole communities via starvation. And yet during all of this famine and death, the state was still extracting millions of tons of grain from Ukraine every year, which could have been used to feed millions. Instead of using it to feed their people, they exported the grain to raise capital. At its peak, the Holodomor was killing 28,000 people every day. In total, the Holodomor killed anywhere from 3.5 to 7 million Ukrainians over the span of just a few years. But how does this link back to meritocracy? Well, as we know, the kulaks were the most successful farmers of their time in Ukraine. Although that itself may be misleading, as the definition of a successful farmer in the Soviet Union mostly just meant you weren't starving and eating dirt, but I digress. These farmers were motivated by a system which provided them incentives to do better. After generations of oppression and serfdom under the Russian Empire and its elite, the kulaks were able to flex their proverbial muscles in this new system. Ironically for the Soviets, the success of the few in this case turned out to be prosperous for the many, as the grain produced by the kulaks far and away exceeded anything coming out of the collectivized farms. Their success wasn't because they were privileged or born into fortunate families or cheating the system. It was because they knew what they were doing, were skilled, and were educated about how to farm effectively. In the Soviet Union, reaching a state of parity meant moving the shoemakers to the farm and the farmer to the shoe factory. But as we can clearly see, that doesn't create a better, more productive society. That only makes things worse. We do not live in a meritocratic society. That's evident enough. The amount of dumbasses with money and power seem to have gotten there more by luck and cunning than anything else. But I believe there exists the whole point. If the elite was determined by skill, our politicians chosen by virtue, and the successful created through grit and determination, then it's undoubtable that our society would be better for it. Most of the critiques of meritocracy I have found researching this video were not actual critiques of the principle itself, rather just giving examples of non-merit-based scenarios to try and prove how the system can be manipulated. I propose an alternative. Instead of looking at the corruption which currently exists as proof of the failure of the system, we must instead see it as a corruption of the system itself, which must be mended. Look, I'm not here to preach how capitalism or meritocracy is a perfect system. It's not. and its negative results are apparent to anyone who can look out their window. But nothing which exists in the real world is perfect. Humanity is flawed, and people will exploit the systems we have in place to the benefit of themselves and to the detriment of others. The key is trying to find a way to make that selfishness work for the good of society, sort of like the Kulaks. The alternatives to meritocracy are either always considerably worse or so nonsensical and optimistic as to hardly even warrant discussion. Does luck play a role in meritocracy? Of course! Luck, or the lack thereof, also plays a role in nearly every part of your life. The fact you didn't die getting hit by a car today is luck. The family you were born into and their wealth is luck. Whether or not you got bloody circumcised is luck. Some people are always going to be more lucky than you. Some people will also be more unlucky. But society can't control luck any more than it can control the nature of people. Life is not fair, and we can either break down and give up, or push on in search of building a better, brighter future for ourselves. Maybe I'm being cynical, but most people don't work for the good of others. They work for the good of themselves. So instead of trying to implement a system to change our very nature, it behooves us to develop a system which harnesses those flaws for good. We shouldn't throw the whole system away. We should be motivated to modify it, make it more robust, and plug the holes which are sinking the ship. I think there exists a common misconception. Meritocracy doesn't mean that everyone is going to become great or successful. It means that anyone can. I'd say we could ask the Kulaks what they thought about meritocracy in society, but they're all dead.